It was the summer of 1888, and the residents of Englewood, Chicago had something new and exciting to talk about. The young, prosperous, and handsome owner of the neighborhood's local pharmacy, who had only arrived in Illinois 3 years earlier, had just bought the big empty lot on the corner of 63rd and Wallace Street. And since then, the owner, 28-year-old Dr. Henry Holmes, had let his many customers know that he was planning to build a grand hotel on that site, the likes of which this village on the south side of the largest Midwestern city in America had never seen before. But some Englewood residents had their doubts. On their way to or from work that July and August, groups of businessmen in black top hats and starched white collars paused at the huge vacant lot, tut-tutting over the cost of building on such marshy land, while sweat-stained day laborers shook their heads over the challenges of sinking a basement and foundation into that soft and shifting ground. But as Dr. Holmes himself looked at that ugly, barren property just across the street from his neat and profitable drugstore, all he felt was thrilled. It was the Gilded Age in America when captains of industry in Chicago lived in mansions so enormous that they looked like castles, showy and glittering gems spread out along South Prairie Avenue and North Lakeshore Drive. And now, after 3 years of hard work and saving money, Dr. Holmes was sure that building and owning this hotel would be his first big step towards joining the exalted ranks of the city's self-made millionaires. The design for the building had come to Dr. Holmes months earlier, all at once, a complete picture right from the start of how the hotel would look both on the outside and on the inside. It would be 3 stories high, the first floor would house retail shops, he would sell his current drugstore and open a new one inside of his hotel on the first floor, along with a jewelry store, a restaurant, a barbershop, and a business that would sell the huge glass window panes that were in such high demand for the skyscrapers that were going up all over the heart of Chicago. The second and third floors of what Dr. Holmes thought of as his castle would each contain 35 rooms, with the third floor offering suites of rooms for long-term residents. His own office would be located on the second floor in a corner overlooking the street. His quarters would also include rooms in the basement that he would use for his medical research. From the outside, the hotel would look impressive but ordinary. It was the interior of the hotel that Holmes intended to design in ways that he hoped would startle and delight the people who came to stay. It didn't take long for Dr. Holmes to commit this vision to paper, and by summer of the following year, 1889, he had the hotel blueprints and design finished, and enough money to start hiring construction workers. And just a few months later, on a hot day in July, Dr. Holmes watched with shining eyes from the doorway of his pharmacy as workers sank the first shovel into the wet earth across the street. His hotel project had officially begun. But despite his excitement, it would turn out that both the businessmen who had tut-tutted and shaken their heads over the cost of the project and the day laborers who had shaken their heads over the difficulty of building in marshy ground were right. The construction of Dr. Holmes's hotel would end up dragging for nearly 2 years until 1891 when they actually opened the hotel, but even then it wasn't done. They still had a year or 2 before it was actually finished. But as delayed as the project was, it actually would have taken even longer if Dr. Holmes had not been lucky enough to hire the man who would become not only his trusted construction foreman, but also his close personal friend. That man was Benjamin Pitezel. Benjamin Pitezel had arrived in Chicago from Indiana around the time Dr. Holmes's hotel was starting to be built. Benjamin was a tall, strong, 33-year-old carpenter who made up for his tendency to drink too much by his absolute devotion to his wife Carrie and their 5 children, who ranged in age from a few months old to 14 years old. Benjamin had come to Chicago determined to take any job he could that would provide for his growing family. And as he helped his wife and children off the train into Chicago's Grand Depot, he took special care with his 9-year-old daughter Nellie, who had been born with a clubfoot, a birth defect that twisted her foot out of shape and made it difficult for her to walk. Like so many people arriving in Chicago for the first time, the Pitezel family could hardly believe the noise and crowds and the skyscrapers in the center of the city that towered above the streets like the walls of a canyon. Another thing they couldn't believe was the smell from the huge stockyards in South Chicago. It wasn't just the smell of livestock. It was the stink from the slaughterhouses located along the South Side Railroad that made Chicago the meatpacking capital of the United States and the hog butcher for the world. After getting off the train, the older Pitezel children immediately covered their noses, but Benjamin told them that the smell wouldn't be so bad once they hopped aboard the next train that would take them out to the village of Englewood, where he'd heard that a hotel was going up, and the owner always seemed to need more workers, so maybe there was a job for him. It wasn't hard for Benjamin to go to the construction site and locate Dr. Holmes, who was now spending most of his time feeling frustrated by what he saw as the shoddy work done by many of the men he had hired. But few, if any, of the workers that Dr. Holmes had let go and withheld wages from afterwards ever stuck around to complain about it. In fact, a lot of these fired workers actually felt relieved as soon as they were let go, because there was something truly unsettling about the hotel's very unorthodox design. The outside was like any other hotel at the time, but the inside was unlike anything they had ever been asked to build before. The blueprints called for secret staircases, false walls and ceilings, trapdoors, and passageways that dead-ended into doors that when you opened them, you were just looking at a wall, not into a room. The blueprints also showed rooms that had no doors or windows and were only accessible via sliding walls or secret passageways. And other rooms on the blueprints appeared normal, but they were actually padded around the outside with a layer of asbestos that made them soundproof. Inside Dr. Holmes's personal office space, workers were ordered to construct a large walk-in vault with a special room built around the outside of it to ensure that the vault could never be removed from the hotel unless the room itself was dismantled first. After one architect was declared incompetent by Dr. Holmes, he proceeded to walk off the site, wondering whether he'd been asked to build a hotel or a carnival-style funhouse. But anytime questions were raised about Dr. Holmes's design, the doctor would just say, "I gave you the blueprints, please just build my hotel." So on the afternoon that Benjamin Pitezel made his way over to the hotel construction site and found Dr. Holmes, he saw that the doctor was in the middle of an argument with the man that he had hired to build a glass-bending furnace in the basement that would produce the windows he hoped to sell in his retail store on the first level. The doctor was telling the furnace maker that the furnace he had just installed was not reaching high enough temperatures, a charge that the tradesman did not believe was true. After the furnace maker angrily stalked away, Dr. Holmes turned to Benjamin, who had put on his best suit and brushed off his worn top hat in preparation for what he hoped would turn into a job interview, and Dr. Holmes immediately noted the effort that Benjamin had clearly made in his appearance, and he instantly took a liking to the tall carpenter with the well-defined chin. To Dr. Holmes, Benjamin immediately seemed like the kind of person he needed to help guide this gargantuan construction project to the finish line. Someone who really knew carpentry and who could handle themselves in what the doctor had come to feel was an increasingly hostile worksite. By the end of their initial 15-minute conversation, Dr. Holmes had indeed offered Benjamin a job, and he recommended temporary lodgings in Englewood for Benjamin and his family. Within just a few weeks, Benjamin had stepped into a supervisory role at the construction site, and sure enough, under his direction, both the quality and pace of work picked up dramatically. And while this was certainly very exciting for Dr. Holmes, it was nothing compared to the excitement he felt in early 1890 when he realized his investment into this hotel was about to pay off big time. In early 1890, Chicago got the news that they had just been named as the location for the 1893 World's Fair, beating out both New York City and St. Louis, Missouri. Chicago politicians and the team of architects who would design the buildings and exhibits for the extravaganza were already estimating that the massive event would attract at least 25 million visitors to the so-called Windy City, a nickname that Chicago had just earned, not for the cold breeze that blew off of nearby Lake Michigan, but because of all the windy talk by Chicago politicians who had assured the World Fair Selection Committee that their upstart city in the Midwest could throw a party like no one on earth had ever seen before. So even as Dr. Holmes tallied up the ever-rising costs of building this hotel, he knew as soon as that fair came to town, he was virtually guaranteed to become a very rich man, because by that time, his hotel would be complete and all those fair attendees would come pouring through his doors looking to rent rooms. In late 1890, about 10 months or so after the announcement of the location of the World's Fair, Ned and Julia Connor were hired by Dr. Holmes to work on the first floor of his nearly completed hotel. Ned was hired to manage the newly opened little jewelry store, and Ned's wife, Julia, had been hired to keep the books in the new drugstore. And if that wasn't good news enough for the couple, the doctor had also offered them, along with their 8-year-old daughter Pearl, free room and board on the second floor of the hotel until the parents earned enough money to buy or rent a place of their own. While Ned was a fairly average man who admired the ambitions of other men more than pursuing any big dreams himself, his wife, Julia, was a 6-foot-tall beauty who was often annoyed by her husband's timidity. Back in Iowa, their lives had been quiet and predictable. Here in Chicago, Julia loved the flow of people into and out of the stores, and she also began to enjoy the attention of the men who were struck by her good looks and small-town naivete. One man in particular, a regular at the hotel who always wore a black bowler hat and who had rooms on the second floor, began spending quite a lot of time in the drugstore, listening very attentively to anything Julia said, and standing very close to her when they talked. Ned was totally oblivious, but his customers were not. They could tell that there was obviously something going on between Ned's wife, Julia, and the man in the bowler hat. A visit from Ned's sister, Gertrude, warmed the increasingly chilly atmosphere that had settled over the room where Ned and Pearl and Julia lived. But not long into what was supposed to be an extended stay, Gertrude suddenly cut her visit short. She didn't give much of an explanation other than to say that she found the hotel very gloomy and strange, and once or twice in the evening she had lost her way in the maze of hallways, and she was certain someone was following her. With Gertrude gone, tensions in the Connor marriage came to a boiling point. Ned didn't know what was wrong with his wife, but it was clear she wanted nothing more to do with him. In the summer of 1891, when he finally threatened to leave her if things did not improve, her answer was immediate and final. Our separation can't happen soon enough. A few months after that, in November of 1891, Julia told the man in the bowler hat, who had gone from just paying close attention to her to sharing her bed, that she was pregnant. The man instantly agreed to marry her, but he had one very specific condition for marriage. Julia agreed to his terms, and after that, they set a date of Christmas Eve to actually perform this very specific thing that the man in the bowler hat required in order to marry her. On Christmas Eve, December 24th, Julia tucked her 8-year-old daughter Pearl into bed. Pearl had missed her father terribly of late, but she was very excited about the presents that might be waiting for her tomorrow under the tree. After Pearl had fallen asleep, Julia left the room and quietly made her way down the dim hotel hallway to a suite of rooms where some of her friends lived. It was Mr. and Mrs. Crow, who were long-term hotel guests. The couple would be leaving the next morning to spend Christmas with their relatives, but Mrs. Crow had invited Julia to decorate a tree in the Crow's apartment for Pearl to enjoy the next day. While they hung ornaments, Julia chatted excitedly about Christmas and about her plans to go to Davenport, Iowa soon with Pearl for the wedding of Julia's older sister. The next morning, Mrs. Crow and her husband got up early and waited by the door patiently for Julia and Pearl to arrive at their apartment. Their plan was to let them in and chat with them for a few minutes and wish them a Merry Christmas before they left for their own Christmas celebration. But Julia and Pearl never arrived, and when Mrs. Crow went down the hallway to knock on Julia's door, there was no answer. Around the same time, while Dr. Holmes was on Christmas vacation himself, he started to receive a number of letters from parents and relatives of women who had vanished. In all of these letters, these heartbroken parents, sisters, and brothers would say that their missing loved one had mentioned being in Englewood, Chicago before they went missing, and so could Dr. Holmes check to see if maybe they were at his hotel or if they had been there recently. Dr. Holmes was alarmed and kind of overwhelmed by these letters, and so he decided to just put them in his desk until he got back to work after the holiday. And when the holiday was over and he did go back to work at the hotel, before he could even begin to dive into these letters, Mrs. Crow approached him and asked him if he knew where his employee, Julia Connor, and her daughter Pearl were, as they still had not been seen or heard from since Christmas Eve. When Dr. Holmes asked his janitor to check on Julia's room, the room looked as though Julia and Pearl had simply gotten up and walked out the door, intending to return at any moment, but obviously they hadn't. As strange as this was, Dr. Holmes knew Julia's marriage had collapsed and that she was trying to plan a trip back to Iowa with her daughter to see family, and so he told Mrs. Crow that Julia and Pearl must have just decided to go to Iowa early. Mrs. Crow was not entirely sold because the whole thing seemed very strange, but she accepted the answer and walked away. After that, Dr. Holmes would spend some time looking into those letters about the other missing women, and he would send some follow-up responses to the family members and friends who had written him, mostly just saying that yes, some of these women had been at his hotel, but he really didn't know what happened to them after they left. Eventually, after looking at so many letters, Dr. Holmes decided that, these missing people were really not his responsibility, and so he kind of just stopped writing back. A few months later, in the spring of 1892, a few weeks before the scheduled start of construction of the Chicago World's Fair, Dr. Holmes hired another bookkeeper to replace Julia, who was still gone. The replacement bookkeeper was a 24-year-old friendly young woman named Emmeline Segrand. She was from Indiana, and she had the lightest color blonde hair Dr. Holmes had ever seen. She was excited at the prospect of working right next to the World's Fair, and she'd brought her life savings with her, $800, which today would be worth more than $26,000. Emmeline rented rooms in a boarding house near the hotel, and it wasn't long after starting her job at the hotel before Emmeline, too, had bumped into the handsome fellow who had earlier won the heart of Julia Connor, the man in the bowler hat. Soon, Emmeline and this man were spending as much time together as they could. Emmeline's handsome suitor taught her how to ride one of the newly designed bicycles that were all the rage, and when Emmeline wasn't working at the hotel, she and the man in the bowler hat, who had quickly become her lover, took long rides along the pathways just outside of Jackson Park, where the fair was slowly being set up. Like hundreds of other residents of neighborhoods near Jackson Park, Emmeline and the man in the bowler hat watched arm in arm as the so-called White City of the Chicago's World Fair began to take shape in front of them. The White City was this huge stretch of land at the center of Jackson Park, where big white stucco buildings were being built to house the fair's thousands of shows and exhibits. That summer, Emmeline's lover had asked her to marry him, and Emmeline hardly waited for him to finish his proposal before she said yes. But by the fall of that year, something had changed inside of Emmeline. She began talking to one of her good friends, her name was Mrs. Lawrence, about her desire to take a trip back to her family in Indiana, and hinting that it likely would be a long visit, that she really needed a break from Englewood. Then, sometime during the first week of December of that year, Emmeline visited Mrs. Lawrence, who lived on the second floor of Dr. Holmes's hotel. But not long after arriving, Emmeline told Mrs. Lawrence that she just hated being in that hotel. It was gloomy and dark and oppressive, and she just hated it. During this visit, Emmeline would also tell Mrs. Lawrence that she was worried about her life savings. She had handed it over to her fiancé, the man in the bowler hat, for safekeeping, as he had suggested. But every time she asked him to return it, he would just kind of blow her off. And as much as it pained her to say this out loud, she could tell his interest in her was also just waning. Before she left, Emmeline would give Mrs. Lawrence a Christmas gift that she had bought for her. Mrs. Lawrence would smile and thank her, and she would tell Emmeline to be sure to come back closer to Christmas because she had a gift for her as well. But shortly after that visit, Emmeline, just like Julia Connor and her daughter Pearl, seemed to have vanished. When Mrs. Lawrence noticed Emmeline's absence, she went to Dr. Holmes's office to see if he knew where she went. And Dr. Holmes, with a slight look of frustration on his face, said that Emmeline had come to him and said she was leaving to get married and go on a honeymoon to Europe, and so he didn't know if she was coming back or not. Which meant, once again, Dr. Holmes was without a bookkeeper and would need to hire yet another one. 3 months later, in March of 1893, Dr. Holmes received yet another inquiry about a missing woman. But this time, it was about a woman he recognized. The sender was Emmeline Segran's father, asking if Dr. Holmes had information that might help the Segrans find their daughter. Dr. Holmes was surprised and wrote back the same thing he had told Mrs. Lawrence, that Emmeline had left the hotel in December because of her marriage plans. Dr. Holmes suggested that the Segrand family contact her other employers and see if maybe they know something, and if they did learn anything about Emmeline's whereabouts, to please contact him and let him know. Emmeline's disappearance put Julia's and Pearl's disappearance in a whole new light for Dr. Holmes. It also made Dr. Holmes look differently at all those letters he had gotten from the family and friends of other missing women in the area. But Dr. Holmes was a busy man, and so not long after writing back to Emmeline's father, he was back focusing on expanding his business empire. An empire that included not only his hotel business, but also his mail order company that sold various ointments and elixirs he developed, including one he claimed cured alcoholism. A few months after Emmeline's father had sent that letter to Dr. Holmes, the World's Fair finally opened its doors. Thousands of people an hour strolled through the gleaming white exhibit halls inside of White City, where visitors from all over the world experienced for the first time things like elevators, moving pictures, voice recordings, Wrigley's chewing gum, Cracker Jack popcorn, and the zipper, which would revolutionize women's fashion. It was the first time people would taste brownies, and the sausages that would later become the Chicago-style hot dog. 38,000 people a day rode on the world's first Ferris wheel, which was more than 25 stories tall and equipped with compartments that looked like rail cars and that held up to 60 people each. There was one man in particular who seemed to attend the fair every night, and that was the man in the bowler hat. He was handsome and refined looking, and he smiled at all the ladies, buying them cold dishes of ice cream while they watched the incredibly popular Wild West show put on by the famous frontiersman Wild Bill Cody. This same man who had seduced Julia Connor and Emmeline Segran before they went missing now graciously opened a path in the crowds for the older wealthy women whose families back home didn't expect to see them for days, and who would never know until it was too late that this wealthy mother or grandmother or relative was never going to come home at all. Smiling and attentive, the man in the bowler hat drifted in and out of the pavilions that housed exotic encampments of people from other countries and walked along the lagoons dotted with sailboats powered by brand new electric motors. Some nights, the man in the bowler hat left the fairgrounds alone. But other nights, as he headed toward Dr. Holmes's World Fair Hotel, he would be holding the arm of a woman, leaning over her protectively as the two of them made their way toward the gloomy castle on 63rd and Wallace. By the time the fair ended on October 30th, 1893, Chicago had in fact shown the world that the Windy City could throw the party to end all parties. The fair wound up breaking all sorts of attendance records, with a staggering 27 million people passing through their gates into the White City, which now stood empty and abandoned inside of Jackson Park. But as successful as the fair had been, it also had a dark side. During the fair, 12 firefighters had died trying to put out a blaze that burned down the Hall of Electricity. The mayor of Chicago, who was scheduled to be a part of the fair's closing ceremonies, was assassinated in his home just 2 days prior by a disgruntled and mentally ill voter. And police and private detective agencies were getting flooded with more and more reports of missing men and women, people who had left homes far away to see the wonders of the world at this fair, and then were never seen again. But with a homicide rate of 4 murders a day in Chicago at the time, police were so overwhelmed by violent crimes that only a very small handful of these missing persons reports got any attention. As for Dr. Holmes, the fair had indeed made him a rich man, but it was bittersweet. Julia and her daughter Pearl were still missing, as was Emmeline, and many of the other missing people in the city had stayed at his hotel before they vanished. This, of course, caused Dr. Holmes a considerable amount of distress, but fortunately, during the fair, Dr. Holmes had met someone, and now, when he was with her, whatever stress he had just seemed to melt away. Her name was Georgiana Yoke. She was 23, small, blonde, and had large blue eyes and a sharp mind. Together, they had wandered the fairgrounds, riding the Ferris wheel and quickly falling in love. By the time the fair ended, they had gotten married. And then, not long after that, with his wife's encouragement, Dr. Holmes decided that as much as he wanted to help all of these families and people who kept writing to him about their missing loved ones, he simply couldn't. He didn't have any answers to give them. And so, from then on, he simply began tucking the new letters he would receive every week into his desk drawer, and then he just did his best to keep going forward in his own life, assuming that the police would handle all of these missing people. But, as Dr. Holmes would eventually learn, no matter what he did or where he went, he would forever be tied to those missing people, because before those people vanished, they encountered the monster that roamed the halls of his hotel, the man in the bowler hat. After the World's Fair ended, Dr. Holmes decided he needed to pursue a new business opportunity, and the idea he thought of was one that he had come up with years earlier when he was a medical student at Michigan University. But at the time, for whatever reason, he had just not acted on this idea. The idea was a little complicated, but the payoff could be huge. However, in order to make it work, the doctor needed a very trustworthy partner. So, late in the summer of 1894, roughly 8 months after the World's Fair had ended, Dr. Holmes looked up his good old trusty hotel construction foreman and close friend, Benjamin Pitezel, who was now living in St. Louis with his wife and children. Benjamin's drinking had only gotten worse over the years, and after finishing up the hotel project, he had struggled to make ends meet financially. So, after hearing Dr. Holmes's pitch about this new business idea, even though it required Ben to move away from his wife and kids temporarily to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, something he really didn't want to do, and even though the plan seemed very risky, Ben ultimately agreed to do it. As for Benjamin's wife, Carrie, she was not thrilled at the idea of her husband being gone for an extended period of time, but like her husband, she trusted Dr. Holmes's business instincts. And just the year before, Dr. Holmes had actually paid out of pocket for Ben to get a life insurance policy worth $10,000, which is approximately $350,000 by today's standards. And as morbid as it was, the thought of that life insurance policy eased the anxiety Carrie felt about her husband temporarily relocating, because if something happened to him, their family would be okay, at least financially. So eventually, Carrie would give the plan her blessing. On the face of it, their plan was simple. Ben would rent office space in Philadelphia and get set up as a patent investor, someone who evaluates the potential success of newly patented inventions and invests money in the ones that look like they have good earning potential. With his knack for gadgets and machinery, all Ben really had to do was identify a couple of good money-making prospects. And then from there, Dr. Holmes would handle the rest. By August of 1894, Benjamin had arrived in Philadelphia and had found a small office with an upstairs set of bedrooms. In the downstairs office window, anyone who was walking by could see a new, neatly lettered sign that read "Patents Bought and Sold." Ben didn't have to wait very long before he had his first customer. It was a young carpenter whose invention for improving the production and quality of handsaws was promising enough that Ben scheduled a second meeting with him for the following week. But when the young man came back the following week to the patent office on Tuesday, September 4th, Benjamin was nowhere to be found. After waiting nearly an hour downstairs, the young man began calling out for Benjamin, but there was no answer. So the young man decided to go investigate. He stood up from the chair he was in and walked around the desk toward the back door of the office that led to a set of creaky stairs. He took those stairs up to the second floor, and as he turned down the short upstairs hallway toward a partially opened door, the young man suddenly stopped. There was this horrible smell in the air. He clapped his hand over his mouth and his nose, and with a terrible sense of dread, he walked forward and then pushed that partially open door all the way open. A minute later, gagging at what he had just seen, the young man was back out on the street. He ran to a nearby drugstore and he told the store owner that something terrible had just happened inside of the new patent investment office a few doors down. A few minutes later, the young man and that shop owner were looking down at the bloated and putrefying corpse of Benjamin Peitzel. Ben was lying on his back on the floor, baking in the hot sunlight that was beating into the room through the glass of the closed window nearby. His hair and part of his face had been badly burned. His tongue was swollen and stuck out of his mouth. Also, draining out of his mouth was a stream of strange-looking red fluid. Just from the looks of it, it seemed fairly obvious that Benjamin had been dead at least for a couple of days. On the floor near Benjamin's body, there was a broken smoking pipe, a match, and a broken glass jar that had contained benzene, a highly flammable liquid that Ben had apparently been mixing with other acids to make a washing powder. An initial investigation by the police determined that Ben had died an accidental death. He must have just been standing too close to the jar of benzene when he struck a match to light his pipe, and then the liquid must have exploded and killed him, burning his face and hair in the process. But based on an examination of Benjamin's body later that afternoon, a very different picture started to emerge about what really happened to Benjamin. And it would turn out what happened to Benjamin had everything to do with the monster inside of Dr. Holmes's hotel, the man in the bowler hat. Based on a series of discoveries that were made following Benjamin's death, this is a reconstruction of what really happened to him and who this monster really was. 2 days before the young man discovered Benjamin's dead body, Benjamin was sitting at the big wooden table in one of the rooms above his patent office. He just received a letter from his wife, Carrie, that said she and their 2-year-old son, Wharton, were sick. Worried, Ben poured himself another glass of whiskey and fiddled absently with his pipe and tobacco pouch. Maybe he should abandon the plan and just go home to St. Louis, at least until Carrie and the children were all healthy again. But just when the whiskey had really started to warm his insides, Ben suddenly heard footsteps on the creaky stairway that led up to the room where he was now sitting. He felt a flash of concern. He wasn't expecting any visitors that day, and whoever had come inside had not rung the bell at the front desk. Getting up from the table, Ben walked unsteadily to the door and peered down the hallway. But who he saw standing there immediately put him at ease. It was the man in the bowler hat. A man Benjamin knew well and had seen many times at Dr. Holmes's hotel in Chicago. But what on earth was the man doing here now? The man in the bowler hat casually slipped right past Ben and settled himself at the wooden table. Without a word, he pulled a brand new pint of whiskey out of a coat pocket and put that down on the table as well. An hour later, just before Ben's eyes closed and his chin dipped to his chest, the man in the bowler hat realized with satisfaction that Ben was very, very drunk. Once he was sure Ben was asleep, the man in the bowler hat pulled a small bottle of chloroform from another coat pocket, along with a big square of clean white cloth. The man tipped the contents of the bottle onto the cloth. Then, standing up and walking over to Ben, the man in the bowler hat pressed the cloth over Ben's mouth and nose. In low doses, chloroform can dull the sensation of pain. In high doses, when inhaled or swallowed, it can be deadly. The man in the bowler hat repeated the sequence several times, gradually upping the amount of chloroform he was administering to his victim. The man did not rush. He enjoyed feeling the slight jerk every time he pressed the cloth against Ben's face. Once the man was sure that Ben was dead, or at least close to it, he pulled Ben's body onto the floor on his back and then poured another 2 ounces of the chloroform straight down Ben's throat, pressing down on Ben's chest at regular intervals to ensure that the drug made its way into Ben's stomach. Once he was satisfied that Ben was dead, the man in the bowler hat carefully arranged the scene so it would look like an accident, and just before he left, he set fire to Ben's hair and coaxed the flame down along the skin of Ben's face. But it would turn out the killer made a huge miscalculation, because the doctors at the morgue who would examine Benjamin's body just hours after it was discovered 2 days later on September 4th, they would find evidence that Ben's death was not an accident. That red fluid they saw draining out of the side of Ben's mouth was apparently a telltale sign that large amounts of chloroform had been forced into his stomach. It would turn out Benjamin was not the man in the bowler hat's first murder victim. Many of the missing people back in Chicago, including Julia Connor, her daughter Pearl, and Emmeline Segrand, whose heartbroken families and friends had written letters to Dr. Holmes asking for his help, had been lured into Dr. Holmes's hotel by this man in the bowler hat, where he would kill them. And to everyone's shock, the man in the bowler hat was none other than Dr. Holmes himself. But as shocking as that was, it was nothing compared to the horrific details of the crimes Dr. Holmes committed. The tip that broke the case wide open and revealed Dr. Holmes's killing spree came from a fellow criminal who had met Dr. Holmes in St. Louis, Missouri. In exchange for the name of a shady attorney who could help Holmes set up the patent office in Philadelphia, Holmes had revealed every detail of the intricate insurance scam he was going to pull off with Benjamin, and he promised this criminal a cut of the profits. According to the plan, Benjamin would arrive in Philadelphia, and once he was all set up as a patent investor, he and Holmes would fake Ben's death and then collect on Ben's life insurance policy, the one that Dr. Holmes had bought for him. And the way they had planned to fake his death was relatively simple. The doctor would substitute a badly decomposed and seemingly unidentifiable dead body from the morgue right in the back of the patent office, and then when the body was discovered, the doctor and Ben's wife Carrie would both claim that the body was that of Benjamin Pitezel. And then the Pitezels and Dr. Holmes would split the huge payout from the life insurance policy 50-50. Except that Dr. Holmes never had any intention of splitting that payout with anyone. Instead, immediately after Dr. Holmes had actually killed his close friend Ben, Dr. Holmes had returned to St. Louis and told Ben's wife Carrie that her husband was alive and well, the plan was going exactly as it should, but Ben would need to stay out of town for a while since people couldn't know he was actually alive. However, Dr. Holmes told Carrie that he knew where Benjamin was and that Benjamin really wanted to see his kids. And so Carrie agreed to let her 13-year-old Alice, 11-year-old Nellie, and 8-year-old Howard go with Dr. Holmes to go see their father for a little while. And Carrie said she would join them all as soon as she and her other kids were well again. In reality, what Dr. Holmes had done was kidnap the 3 Pitezel children. He took them away from their mother so he could hold them hostage while he forced her to give him more and more of her share of the insurance money. On November 17th, 10 weeks after Benjamin's death, Detectives from the famous Pinkerton Private Security and Detective Agency, who had been hired by Philadelphia Fidelity Insurance Company, finally tracked Dr. Holmes down in Boston, Massachusetts. They immediately arrested him, and even though they totally suspected he had killed Benjamin, they didn't have proof, so they could only charge him with fraud, and then they sent him to Philadelphia to stand trial. But it wasn't the fraud charges that would grip the world's attention. It was the fact that 3 of the Pitezel children were still missing, and the last time anyone had seen them, they were with the man suspected of killing their father. And when Dr. Holmes and Ben's wife Carrie both appeared in court in Philadelphia to face these fraud charges, the stricken mother could not have cared less about the money. She had only one question for the police and for Dr. Holmes and for all of America. Where are my children? It was a question that would become banner headlines across the country. It would also become an absolute obsession for one Philadelphia detective named Frank Geyser, who was determined to find the answer. Throughout the summer of 1895, everyone in the country held their breath as they followed the path of Detective Geyser as he crisscrossed the United States and Canada looking for the missing Pitezel children. Using letters that little Alice and Nellie had written to their mother over the weeks they were dragged from place to place by their captor, Dr. Holmes, Detective Geyser would eventually make 3 heartbreaking discoveries. Dr. Holmes, of course, never actually sent these letters the girls had written, in which they had named and described different places they were staying, and they had begged their mother to come get them or at least write back to them. Instead, Dr. Holmes kept their letters in a metal box that police would find among his possessions. On July 15th, buried in the backyard of a charming little house that Dr. Holmes had rented back in October of the previous year, Detective Frank Geyser found the bodies of the 2 Pitezel sisters. Alice and Nellie had been forced by Dr. Holmes to climb inside of a trunk together where they were gassed to death. The doctor then dragged their small bodies outside and tossed them into a shallow grave. Before covering their bodies with earth, Dr. Holmes had cut off Nellie's legs so her body could not be identified by the girl's club foot. It wasn't until weeks later, on August 27th, that Detective Geyser finally succeeded in finding the 3rd missing Pitezel child, 8-year-old Howard. Dr. Holmes had poisoned the little boy, cut his body into pieces, and then burned the pieces inside of a coal stove in another house the doctor had rented in Indiana. Along with a clotted mass of the boy's hair and bones that had gotten caught inside of the stovepipe, Detective Geyser found the little boy's most treasured possession collecting dust in the corner of the living room. It was a brightly colored spinning top with a handle in the shape of a tiny man that Benjamin had bought for his son at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. As news spread about the discovery of the 3 Pitezel children's bodies, Dr. Holmes was finally charged with 4 counts of murder. On July 19th, shortly after the discovery of Alice and Nellie, Chicago police lined up outside of Dr. Holmes's hotel and began a floor-by-floor, room-by-room search of the building. And what they discovered would finally explain why the layout of Dr. Holmes's hotel was so strange. It was because he had literally built the hotel to kill people. The moving doors and dead-end passages were perfect for stalking his disoriented guests, mostly young vulnerable women and older wealthy women whom he could rob before killing. After he killed them, he would slip their bodies into an opening in the wall on the 2nd floor that led to a greased chute, and then the bodies would tumble down the chute into the basement where he could dispose of the corpses at his leisure. The furnace in the basement was not a glass-bending furnace. It was a furnace for cremating bodies. The hotel's soundproof rooms with the peepholes and the secret gas piping that led directly into them meant that he could gas his victims and watch them slowly die in agony while no one could hear their screams and cries for help. And in one room, investigators discovered a blood-soaked wooden dissection table, along with women's bloody clothes and undergarments, and a bag of the doctor's lethal surgical tools. It was here, on that dissection table, that Dr. Holmes had taken Julia Connor late on Christmas Eve in 1891. She was pregnant with Dr. Holmes's baby, and the specific condition for marriage that Dr. Holmes had required, that Julia had agreed to, was that Julia would get an abortion performed by Dr. Holmes himself. But after Julia climbed up on that table to have this operation done, the doctor just began stabbing and slicing her. After he killed Julia and then went upstairs and promptly killed her 8-year-old daughter Pearl, it's believed Dr. Holmes then stripped all the flesh from their bones and sold their skeletons to a nearby medical school. As for Emmeline Cigrand, instead of marrying his young assistant as promised on those afternoons they spent at the World's Fair, he lured her inside of the walk-in vault in his office and then shut and locked the door behind her. For a while, Dr. Holmes just allowed himself to enjoy the sound of her sobs and cries for help in the airless, soundproof chamber. But once those delicious noises began to ebb, he turned on the gas that led into the vault. Police would discover a print of Emmeline's foot stamped into the door of the vault, where, in her final moments, she had pressed with all of her might to try to force the door open. At Dr. Holmes's trial for the murder of Benjamin and the 3 Pitezel children, Dr. Holmes's wife, Georgiana Yoke, was shocked for a lot of reasons, but she was especially shocked to discover that she was actually one of 3 women, all married to the same man, Dr. Holmes. 3 living wives, that is. Dr. Holmes is also assumed to have killed one other woman who he married in order to inherit her deed to a valuable piece of land in Texas. As Dr. Holmes abandoned one wife after another without legally divorcing them, he also abandoned at least 2 legitimate children he had fathered. In April of 1896, convicted of murder, locked in prison, and facing the death penalty, Dr. Holmes confessed to having committed at least 27 murders. In his autobiography, Dr. Holmes wrote, quote, "I was born with the devil in me. I could not help the fact that I was a murderer, no more than a poet can help the inspiration to sing." On May 7, 1896, Dr. Holmes stepped up onto the gallows at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia. After kneeling down and murmuring a prayer to himself, Dr. Holmes stood, and the guards put a black cloth bag over his head and placed a noose around his neck. At 10:13 a.m., the trapdoor underneath Dr. Holmes's feet suddenly opened, and down he fell. It would take 15 minutes of violent squirming and jerking around before America's first serial killer was finally dead. It was past midnight in June of 2020 in Sandusky, Ohio, and 25-year-old Lauren Wells lay in her bed wide awake. She had to be up early for work and had been trying to fall asleep for hours, but all night long, the faint sound of music coming from her upstairs neighbors had made sleep impossible. The tune they kept playing was extremely irritating. Sometimes it was very generic sounding, like elevator music. Then it seemed to switch to some kind of strange experimental jazz. Lauren had just moved into her apartment and didn't want to cause any trouble with her new neighbors, but they clearly were not stopping anytime soon. So she finally climbed out of bed and grabbed her broom. She was just about to knock on the ceiling with her broom when the direction of the music suddenly changed. Now it sounded like it was coming from next door. Lauren shook her head in frustration. She didn't want to start a fight with the entire complex, so she climbed back into her bed and threw her pillow over her head. She could still hear the music, but eventually she drifted off to sleep. The next morning at 8 a.m., Lauren arrived at her job as a nursing home administrator. She had just been hired 2 months ago, and she was proud that she'd gotten this position at such a young age. Running the nursing home was Lauren's dream job. She loved interacting with the elderly residents and wanted to make a difference in their lives. So even though she was running on fumes at this point from a lack of sleep, Lauren pushed through the day, checking in on staff and residents, and running various meetings. Thankfully, it was a Friday, so Lauren had the weekend to look forward to. She and her friends were heading to one of the islands off of Lake Erie,
which is one of the Great Lakes. Lauren hoped some time outdoors would help her regain some energy. And the weekend getaway was just what she needed. The sun was out, there was a gentle breeze over the lake, and the water was cool and refreshing. Lauren was excited to reconnect with her best friends, and on their first night out, they went out to dance and have some drinks. She forgot about work and her annoying neighbors and just enjoyed herself. But as the evening progressed, Lauren found herself using the bathroom more than usual, but she figured it was just because she was drinking. A little while later, when she was on the dance floor, she felt a sharp pain on her left side. The pain stayed with her the rest of the night. She thought it was menstrual cramps and did her best to ignore them. Nothing was going to stop her from having a fun weekend. And by the time she got home Sunday night, she was feeling better, just like she had hoped. But soon after Lauren stepped into her apartment, her good mood evaporated. Her neighbors were playing that annoying elevator music again. The faint melodies seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Lauren dropped her bags and shook her head. She wasn't going to let this upset her. It was late and she knew she needed to get some sleep. So she unpacked and got ready for bed. But just like before, it was impossible to relax with that music coming through the walls. She tossed and turned for hours until finally exhaustion overtook her. When Monday morning rolled around, Lauren was definitely not feeling well. She figured she was paying for her weekend of partying, so she tried to shake it off. She made herself a cup of coffee and got on the treadmill for her daily run. But she'd only been on the treadmill for a minute when once again she felt an intense pain in her left side and had to stop running. It almost felt like someone was punching her hard, but from the inside. This pain went far beyond menstrual cramps. She figured something else had to be going on. Lauren thought back to everything she did at Lake Erie. She wondered if she had pulled a muscle while she was out swimming. It didn't seem likely, but she couldn't think of anything else that would explain the pain. Lauren had no idea how she was going to get through the day, much less the week, but she didn't want to call in sick. She was still new to her job, and people were counting on her. So she slowly got dressed while wincing in pain and got ready for work. And as she did, she thought to herself, at least her neighbors weren't playing that god-awful music. Once Lauren arrived at work, she did her morning rounds and sat down at her desk to take care of some paperwork. But as hard as she tried, she just couldn't focus. There was something distracting her. It was that weird music she kept hearing in her apartment. It made no sense that the same music would be playing in the nursing home. Lauren looked around just to see if there were any speakers nearby, but there was none. She tried to ignore the disjointed melody, but it was impossible. It seemed like it was coming from everywhere. But then she realized something that made her heart start racing. If there really wasn't any music actually playing right now, that could only mean one thing. The music was only happening in her head. She wondered if she was going crazy, but before she jumped to any conclusions, Lauren thought of someone who might be able to help her. She had a friend who was an audiologist, which is a doctor that specializes in hearing. Lauren called her right away and explained what was going on. She described the strange, repetitive sound and said it was following her everywhere. Lauren's friend listened patiently, then told her that what she was describing sounded upsetting, but it actually wasn't uncommon. She promised that Lauren was not going crazy. She said that sometimes people can hear melodies in everyday noises, like busy traffic or the hum of air conditioners, and just like songs that get stuck in your head, these sounds can do the same thing. Since Lauren was clearly so tired, she was probably more susceptible to hearing these noises. Her friend was sure that once Lauren just got some quality sleep, this weird music she was hearing would go away. Lauren was relieved, but also frustrated. The music was actually the thing keeping her from sleeping in the first place. But she was glad to know that if she could just get some rest, maybe her life would go back to normal. As the week went by, Lauren did her best to stay relaxed, but the music in her head just would not stop, and it continued to make sleep nearly impossible. And so a few days after talking to her friend, Lauren again dragged herself to work, and as she headed down the hall toward her office, she noticed a new odd sensation. Her hands felt like they were covered in a thick layer of dirt, and they felt sticky too, almost as if a glue stick had melted in her palm. She kept scrubbing her hands with soap and hot water, but she couldn't get them to feel clean. Lauren was totally confused. She'd never felt anything like this before. And it wasn't long before that same sensation spread to her feet. Lauren felt like her socks were glued to her toes. At first, it was just a little bit irritating, but then it became totally unbearable. She started going barefoot at work, which helped a little bit. She realized it was weird, but she couldn't stand the thought of putting her shoes and socks back on. Lauren was afraid that there was a connection between her auditory hallucinations and now her hands and feet feeling dirty all the time. But she had no idea what that connection could be. Lauren's instinct was telling her to go see a doctor, but she imagined how ridiculous it would all sound. She hung on to what her friend, the audiologist, had told her about feeling better with some rest. And so Lauren convinced herself that this was the weekend she would finally get some sleep and all these problems would just finally go away. That Saturday night, more than 2 weeks after her strange symptoms had begun, Lauren climbed into bed exhausted. She tried to ignore the strange soundtrack playing in her head, her sticky hands and feet, and the dull pain still in her left side. She pulled the comforter up to her chin, and she tried to meditate, letting the sounds of birds outside her window lull her to sleep. But after a few minutes, Lauren's eyes flew open. She realized that the birds singing outside her window were seagulls. Seagulls live near water, and there was not an ocean or a lake anywhere near her. The seagulls got louder and louder, and finally sounded like they might just fly right into her room at any second. Lauren knew that no amount of rest was going to make them go away, because just like the music, these squawking seagulls were in her head. She couldn't wait any longer. She needed to see a doctor. Almost 500 miles away in Easton, Pennsylvania, Lauren's father, Brad, was sound asleep at home when his phone rang. He saw Lauren's name on the caller ID and felt his stomach tighten. She wouldn't be calling so late if something wasn't wrong. After he answered the phone, Lauren told him what had been going on for the past couple of weeks. She had reached the point where she was so worried about her symptoms that she was heading to the emergency room to get checked out. Brad could hear the panic in her voice, and that made him scared. He was fully awake now, calculating how long it would take him to drive to Ohio. He jumped out of bed and reached for his clothes, telling Lauren he was on his way, but she told him he should stay home. She wanted to see what the doctor had to say before he made such a long trip. Brad reluctantly agreed to hold off, but he told Lauren to call as soon as she had any answers. 30 minutes after talking to her father, Lauren arrived at the emergency room. She took a breath and then described her symptoms to the admissions nurse, expecting to get some strange looks. But the nurse just nodded and took some notes. Then Lauren was sent back to see a doctor, who performed an exam and drew her blood. Lauren waited anxiously as they processed her results. And after a little while, the doctor approached Lauren's hospital bed. She searched his face, looking for any sign of concern, but his expression seemed totally relaxed. He told Lauren that her tests were completely normal. He didn't think anything was really wrong with her. As he spoke, he flipped through her chart and asked about her work. She explained she'd recently moved and started a new job. The doctor nodded and said he understood, and he said, Lauren, you're probably just stressed. And then he prescribed her some anti-anxiety medication, and he gave her an order to see a psychiatrist. Lauren was frustrated with the doctor's diagnosis, but he seemed to be certain there wasn't anything else going on with her. So Lauren left the ER feeling somewhat unsettled, and on the way home, she called her father, Brad. Lauren could always rely on him to be supportive and honest with her. She told him how annoyed she was that all these doctors just assumed she was stressed because of her new job. But she was thriving there and loved the new challenge. It didn't make sense to put the blame solely on stress. Her dad said he totally understood her frustration, but the doctors knew what they were doing. He asked Lauren to at least start taking the anti-anxiety medication. With any luck, they'd let her get some sleep, and then at that point, with a clear head, she could reassess her situation. Lauren was not convinced, but she promised her dad that she would try. Later that week, Lauren drove to work as usual. She'd been taking her anxiety medication, but so far, it really wasn't helping. She still heard all the mysterious music playing everywhere she went, and so she really wasn't getting more than an hour or two of sleep at night. She gulped down some strong black coffee, but nothing could cut through her brain fog. She'd been a zombie at work all week, often losing track of what she was supposed to be doing. Lauren turned into the parking lot, pulled into her parking spot, and then got out of her car, and as she walked towards the building, she left the engine running and her keys in the ignition, and her laptop and purse were still on the passenger seat. Lauren entered the conference room in a daze. She felt like she was moving in slow motion, and she barely registered the team of nurses who were already there for the weekly staff meeting. Lauren sat down at the table and tried to read the agenda, but the words looked like a jumble of hieroglyphics. At some point, Lauren tried to say something, but nothing came out of her mouth. She looked at the faces of her colleagues, who were now staring at her in confusion, and suddenly, Lauren realized she had no idea how she had gotten there or what she was supposed to do. The nurses who were at the meeting with Lauren could tell something was wrong with her. They helped Lauren lie down on a nearby sofa and took her blood pressure, which was extremely high. She could hear another nurse calling 911. Lauren tried not to panic, but the fear was overwhelming. Then her mind went totally blank. By the time the ambulance arrived, Lauren was starting to come out of her trance-like state. The fog that had been clouding her mind had lifted, and she felt more clear-headed than she had in a long time. She insisted that she did not need to go to the hospital, but the staff wouldn't hear of it. And so, after some gentle coaxing, they convinced Lauren to get in the ambulance. The paramedics took Lauren to a local hospital where doctors ran a series of tests. As she waited for the results, she felt surprisingly calm. She was so relaxed that she began texting her friends to come hang out with her in the hospital. She said she was having a great time. Lauren's friends were taken aback by these text messages. They knew what she was going through, and this just didn't sound like her at all. A little while later, Lauren's father, Brad, was busy at work when his cell phone rang. He'd been on edge the whole week, worrying about his daughter. When he saw it wasn't her number, he felt relieved. But then he realized the person calling him had an area code from Sandusky, the town where Lauren lived. Brad's stomach tightened as he answered. It was one of Lauren's friends. She told Brad that Lauren was in the hospital and that she was not doing well. This time, Brad didn't hesitate. He raced home, threw some clothes in a suitcase, and sped off to make the 7-hour drive to Sandusky. Meanwhile, Lauren was waiting at the hospital for more test results. One of her close friends, who had come to the ER, was sitting next to her. When the doctor came back to Lauren, he gave her some good news. Her test results had all come back negative, just like before. They couldn't explain what had happened to her at work, but physically she was fine and she could be discharged. Lauren thanked him, then she turned to her friend and said that it must have been another false alarm. But Lauren could tell her friend still looked worried. And deep in her heart, Lauren knew she wasn't okay, no matter what these tests said. Her symptoms might have temporarily gone away, but they were going to return, and as she thought about that, she began to feel this terrible dread come over her. Lauren asked the doctor if there was any other alternative to being discharged. The doctor hesitated, and then he said yes, there was, but it was drastic. Seven hours later, Brad finally arrived at the hospital in Sandusky, and he raced to the admissions desk. Just moments earlier, his daughter had called him with the stunning news that she was admitting herself into the psychiatric ward of the hospital. And so Brad, all he wanted to do was just get to his daughter. Once he entered the patient area, Brad was greeted by a doctor and brought to Lauren's room. But he was only allowed to see her through a shatterproof glass window on her locked door, and what he saw shook him to the core. Lauren was writhing on the floor, screaming and begging to be let out. She was trying to tear off her shirt. Food was splattered on the walls, and an empty tray and plate were upside down on the floor. Brad was stunned. Lauren had called him just a couple of hours earlier and seemed fairly clear-headed, and so he didn't understand how her condition could have changed so drastically. The doctor explained that he was giving Lauren medicine to treat schizophrenia, which is a serious mental disorder that causes people to hallucinate and experience delusions. They'd already started on her medication, but it would need time to take effect. Brad shook his head in disbelief. There was no history of mental illness in their family, and Lauren had always been so happy and well-adjusted. The doctor could only shrug. Schizophrenia did have a tendency to run in families, but it also struck out of the blue, usually in young adults anytime between their late teens and early 20s, and Lauren was 25. The diagnosis was terrifying. Brad was desperate to do something to help, but all he could do was wait for Lauren's medication to kick in. It was early in the morning when Brad left the hospital after Lauren had finally calmed down. He checked into a nearby hotel and sank into an exhausted sleep, thinking about his daughter and praying that she would be back to her normal self by the time he woke up. After sleeping for a few hours, Brad returned to the hospital, and when he got there, the nurse gave him a rundown of Lauren's condition. She said Lauren had begged the staff to use their hospital phone, and then when they said yes, she had called friends and relatives repeatedly, forgetting she'd already spoken with them. She'd also become very aggressive with the hospital staff. Brad insisted on going into his daughter's room, so they unlocked her door and he walked in softly, not wanting to scare her. Lauren was sitting on a rumpled bed staring into the distance. Her hair was disheveled and there were dark circles under her eyes. He almost didn't even recognize her. Brad struggled to stay calm as he sat down next to Lauren. He tried to comfort her and asked her if she needed anything, but she didn't respond. The medications she was on didn't seem to be working, but the doctor said it could take a while to kick in. Without anything else to hold on to, Brad clung on to that hope. Over the next few days, Brad anxiously waited for Lauren to improve as doctors tried different combinations of medications. But on the 5th night after Lauren was admitted to the psych ward, things got even worse. Brad had gone back to his hotel, and in a routine that had become too familiar, a phone call startled him awake. It was someone from the hospital. Lauren had experienced a massive seizure and was being transferred to the ICU for further testing. Brad ran to his car, and by the time he arrived at the ICU, Lauren was heavily sedated. He flagged down a doctor in the hall and bombarded her with questions, but it was clear that the doctor was just as much in the dark as he was. All she knew was that Lauren was in critical condition and they were trying to figure out what was wrong. Afterward, in the waiting room, Brad called friends and family to update them. He tried to piece together everything that had happened to her in the last several weeks, hunting for any clues that might explain her illness, but all he had was a long list of strange symptoms and events. Brad didn't know what to do, but he was desperate for answers, and so he began mentally going through his list of friends who might have some perspective that could be useful right now about Lauren. And as he did this, one name came up that he and Lauren both had in common: Ken Zemanek. Ken was the father of twin girls who were Lauren's best friends from childhood, and he was also a psychiatrist. And so Brad hoped Ken could provide some perspective about Lauren's mental state. When he got Ken on the phone, Brad was afraid that Ken would tell him the same things as all the other doctors, that it was possible Lauren had schizophrenia, or that Brad just needed to be patient and wait for more test results. But once Brad finished going through Lauren's extensive list of strange symptoms, Ken didn't say a word. After a long pause, he said that the hallucinations and mood swings did point to a mental issue. But what troubled Ken was the seizure. Schizophrenia couldn't have caused that to happen. Ken paused again, and then told Brad he did have another thought, one that could potentially explain everything that had been happening to Lauren. He described it as a, quote, rare bird, or extremely rare condition. He suggested that Brad ask Lauren's doctors to test her for this rare condition. Brad listened intently. It was a long shot, but it was all he had. After Brad hung up with Ken, Brad Googled anything he could find about this rare disease Ken had mentioned. And the more he read about it, the more convinced he became that it was what was happening to Lauren. Brad headed straight to the nurse's station and asked to speak with one of Lauren's doctors right away. For the first time since Lauren's nightmare had started, he felt a real glimmer of hope. The on-duty doctor arrived, and Brad told him about his conversation with Ken Zemanek, but the doctor was hesitant to test for it right away. The condition Brad described was incredibly unusual, and they needed to test for more common conditions first. Brad immediately tried speaking with another one of Lauren's doctors to see if maybe they would test for it, but that doctor said the same thing. They were going to test for common things first, and this doctor would say that in their entire career, they had never seen a patient with something that rare before. And so a parade of specialists marched in and out of Lauren's room, but every test they ran was inconclusive. As the hours ticked by, Brad's frustration grew. The next morning, Brad arrived at the hospital and headed straight to the ICU. As he walked down the hallway leading to Lauren's room, he heard a commotion of voices and the sound of beeping monitors. He ran into his daughter's room and saw a team of doctors hovering over Lauren. She was lying motionless on the bed and her eyes were closed. Brad stood there in shocked silence until a doctor noticed him and rushed over. He told Brad that Lauren's vital signs were dropping and they were working to get her stabilized. And so Brad needed to leave and go to the waiting area until the situation was under control. But Brad was sick of waiting in a medical twilight zone. His daughter was on the verge of death and they still had no idea what was wrong with her. He demanded they run the tests that he had requested about this rare illness. The doctor hesitated, but then nodded. He finally admitted that they were hitting a total brick wall and were at an absolute loss. But they were at a small community hospital, and so their resources were very limited to both test and treat Lauren for this rare condition if she were to have it. And so if Brad wanted to get her the help she needed, they'd have to transfer her to the Cleveland clinic, which was over an hour away. However, getting there was a huge risk. Lauren was so weak she could die on the transit. Brad was facing the biggest decision of his life, but he didn't hesitate. A few minutes later, Lauren was loaded into the back of an ambulance, headed for the Cleveland clinic. Brad followed behind in his car, praying his daughter could hold on just a little longer. When the ambulance finally arrived at the clinic, a medical team was waiting. Brad quickly parked his car and joined them as the team grabbed the gurney that Lauren was on and rushed her towards the entrance. Brad tried to stay calm as he watched them wheel her to the neurological ICU. Lauren's heartbeat barely registered, and she was having trouble breathing on her own. The doctors told Brad that her brain had also begun to swell, and so they needed to put her into a medically induced coma to help bring the swelling down. Lauren was given a strong sedative through an IV drip to put her into a state of unconsciousness. She was then hooked up to a ventilator that went into her mouth and down her throat to keep her breathing, and a feeding tube was inserted inside her nose and down into her stomach. Brad tried not to show how scared he was, but he knew Lauren was hanging on by a thread. Brad spent the next several hours anxiously pacing in the lobby of the ICU while the heads of several departments at the Cleveland Clinic teamed up in an attempt to save Lauren's life. Finally, one of Lauren's doctors walked in with the results of Lauren's newest round of tests. The doctor was incredulous. Brad and his good friend, Ken Zemanek, had been right. Lauren was sick with something that was so unheard of, most doctors would never think to even test for it. She had a disease called anti-NMDAR encephalitis. Anti-NMDAR is extremely rare, affecting only 1 out of 1.5 million people per year. It had only been identified 13 years earlier in 2007. The disease causes severe inflammation of the brain, which then results in hallucinations and a total psychotic breakdown. This explained almost all of Lauren's symptoms, like hearing the strange music and the seagulls and the sticky feelings on her hands and feet. But it turned out that NMDAR by itself wasn't what caused Lauren to get so sick. The doctor explained that the disease usually signified a deeper, even rarer underlying condition, which would have caused Lauren's other symptoms, like the pain in her side and the frequent need to urinate. Those symptoms were caused by a tumor in her ovary called a teratoma. Teratomas usually strike young women. This kind of tumor is made up of tissue from other parts of the body, like hair, muscle, nerve, organ, or bone. Normally, when the immune system recognizes a tumor in the body, it creates antibodies to try and kill it off. However, the specific type of antibodies formed from a teratoma can end up targeting more than just the tumor. They can also attack the brain and cause anti-NMDAR. In trying to defend her body against this tumor, Lauren's brain had accidentally attacked itself. Brad nearly collapsed from relief. They had a clear-cut answer for what Lauren was up against. It meant they weren't working in the dark. Now they just needed to get the tumor out. A surgeon removed the teratoma the next morning. It was 13 centimeters long, so more than 5 inches long. And unfortunately, it was malignant, which meant Lauren needed chemotherapy in order to fully recover. For the next 2 weeks, Lauren stayed in a medically induced coma. Once she was finally awakened, she couldn't remember anything that had happened to her. She had to relearn how to walk and how to talk, but day by day she got stronger and was finally well enough to go home. 6 months later, Lauren got the news they'd all been hoping for. She was now officially cancer-free. After a full recovery, she went on to graduate from school and earned an advanced degree. Then, in April of 2022, she took a new job as executive director of a senior living facility. She never heard phantom elevator music or seagulls again. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Steve Chivers. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Matthew Chalelli. Coordinating producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak, Natalie Bettendorf, and Tasia Palaconda. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson. For Ballen Studios, our producer is Alyssa Tomanang. Our head of production